April 1917, Vimy Ridge, France. The frozen mud stretched for miles under gray skies. Artillery shells had turned the earth into a nightmare landscape of craters, broken trees, and tangled barbed wire. For 2.5 years, this ridge had belonged to Germany. From its heights, German soldiers could see everything the Allies did for 7 miles in every direction. French commanders had thrown their best troops at these slopes. Then, the British tried. Over 150,000 men had died trying to take this single piece of high ground. All of them failed. The ridge was supposed to be impossible to capture. German machine gun nests sat in concrete bunkers that could survive almost any bombardment. Their artillery observers had perfect views of anyone approaching. Trenches zigzagged up the slopes in layers, each one protecting the next. Barbed wire spread thick as a forest between the lines. When French soldiers charged in 1915, German machine guns cut them down by the thousands. When British forces attacked in 1916, the same thing happened. The ground was soaked with the blood of brave men who never made it past the first line of wire. German commanders felt completely safe on Vimy Ridge. They had built deep tunnels under the battlefield where soldiers could sleep protected from shells. They had stockpiled ammunition and supplies. Their officers wrote letters home saying this position would never fall. One German general told his men that holding Vimy was like holding a fortress. As long as they owned these slopes, the Allies could never break through. The Germans were so confident that some units treated their time on Vimy Ridge like a vacation from the real fighting. British High Command looked at their maps in early 1917 and felt desperate. They needed to take Vimy Ridge. Without it, their entire spring offensive would fail before it started. But who could do it? The best French divisions had tried and been destroyed. Elite British units had attacked and been pushed back. Then, someone suggested the Canadians. 4 divisions of soldiers from Canada were available. They had fought well enough at the Somme, people said. Maybe they could at least keep the Germans busy while the main attacks happened elsewhere. Many British generals did not think much of the Canadian Corps. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers who had left their wheat fields. They were lumberjacks from forests so far north that most Europeans had never heard of those places. They were store clerks and factory workers who had never seen a real battle until they crossed the ocean. Yes, they were big men and strong from hard work, but they had no military tradition. Canada was a peaceful country. It had no great generals, no famous victories, no warrior culture. Sending Canadians to take Vimy Ridge seemed like sending them to die for nothing. The man chosen to lead them seemed even less impressive. General Arthur Currie had been a real estate salesman before the war. He sold houses and land in British Columbia. He had no formal military training at elite academies. He was not from an old military family. His father had not been a general. He had learned about war by reading books and studying battles, not by growing up around soldiers. When he put on his uniform, some British officers laughed behind his back. A shopkeeper playing at being a general, they whispered. But Currie saw something that the British and French commanders had missed. He watched how his soldiers acted. He listened to them talk. These men were not peasants who followed orders without thinking. Back home in Canada, many of them owned their own farms. They made their own decisions. They solved their own problems. They were used to figuring things out for themselves. Currie thought about all those failed attacks on Vimy Ridge. He thought about brave men charging forward without understanding why or how or what came next. They just followed orders until they died. One night, Currie stood looking at maps of Vimy Ridge in his command post. Candles flickered on the table. He could hear distant artillery rumbling like thunder. A British colonel was visiting, explaining how the attack should work. The colonel pointed at the map and talked about waves of men going forward at set times. "Do not worry about the details," the colonel said. "Just tell your men when to advance and where to go. That is all soldiers need to know." Currie stared at the map for a long moment. Then he said something that made the British colonel stop talking. "What if we told every single soldier the entire plan? What if a private knew as much about the battle as a captain? What if every man understood not just his own job, but what the units on his left and right were doing? What if they knew where the German strongpoints were and how the artillery would help them? The British colonel looked confused. That would take weeks, he said. You cannot teach thousands of men such complex things. They are just ordinary soldiers. They do not need to know strategy. They just need to follow orders. Currie looked back at the map. His finger traced the slopes of Vimy Ridge. Maybe that is why everyone keeps failing, he said quietly. Maybe soldiers fight better when they understand what they are fighting for and how to win. Maybe these ordinary men from Canada could do something extraordinary if we treated them like thinking people instead of pawns on a chessboard. The colonel left shaking his head. But Currie had made his decision. He would do something no one had tried before. He would trust his soldiers with the truth. Currie gathered his officers in a large tent behind the front lines. On tables in the center sat something most of them had never seen before. Detailed models made of sand, dirt, and painted wood showed every inch of Vimy Ridge. The models were not simple drawings. They showed every German trench, every machine gun position, every artillery bunker. Tiny flags marked where barbed wire was thickest. Small wooden blocks represented enemy strongpoints. The models were so detailed that a soldier could trace his exact path up the slope with his finger. This is what we are going to do, Currie told his officers. Every single man in the Canadian Corps is going to study these models. Every private, every corporal, every sergeant will know the entire battle plan. They will know where they are going. They will know why they are going there. They will know what happens if they succeed and what happens if they fail. We are going to show them everything. Some officers looked shocked. Sir, one captain said, that could take months. We have 100,000 men. How can we teach them all these details? And what if the Germans capture someone who knows the whole plan? Currie had thought about this. We have 6 weeks before the attack, he said. That is enough time. And if a German captures one of our men and learns our plan, so what? Knowing what we will do and stopping us from doing it are two different things. Our men will be so well trained that the Germans cannot stop them even if they know everything. Behind the Canadian lines, soldiers began building something strange. They dug trenches in the exact shape of the German trenches on Vimy Ridge. They placed barbed wire in the same patterns. They built mock machine gun nests in the same positions. It was like creating a copy of the battlefield miles away from the real fighting. Engineers measured everything carefully. If a German trench on Vimy Ridge was 70 yards long, the practice trench was 70 yards long. If two enemy positions were separated by 200 yards, the practice positions matched that distance exactly. Canadian soldiers practiced attacking these fake trenches again and again. They learned to move forward together, covering each other. They memorized the timing. Officers with stopwatches called out commands. First wave advances in 3 minutes. Second wave follows 30 seconds later. Artillery shifts forward in exactly 3 minutes and 15 seconds. If the artillery moved too soon, it would hit friendly troops. If it moved too late, the Germans would have time to climb out of their bunkers and man their machine guns. Currie introduced an idea that artillery officers had been testing but never used on such a large scale. He called it the creeping barrage. Instead of shelling the German lines and then stopping so infantry could charge, the artillery would keep firing as the soldiers advanced. The shells would land 100 yards ahead of the attacking troops. Then, after exactly 3 minutes, the artillery would shift forward another 100 yards. The infantry would follow 75 yards behind the exploding shells, walking into the smoke and dust before the Germans could recover. The timing had to be perfect. Artillery officers practiced with stopwatches. Gunners loaded shells over and over trying to work faster without making mistakes. They had to fire, reload, and fire again in exactly the same rhythm for hours. One artillery captain told Currie it was impossible. Sir, he said, we cannot coordinate 983 guns to fire in perfect timing. If one battery is 5 seconds late, it will hit our own men. Currie looked at him calmly. Then we practice until it is not impossible, he said. We practice until every gunner can do this in his sleep. British commanders heard about Currie's plans, and many of them thought he was wasting time. A British general visited the training grounds and watched Canadian soldiers practice their advance. "This is too complicated," the general said. "Your men will forget everything when the real shells start falling. Just tell them to charge forward and fight. That is what soldiers do." But one man supported Currie completely. General Julian Byng commanded the entire Canadian Corps under British High Command. Byng was a professional soldier from an old British military family, but he was not like other British generals. He had watched the Canadians fight. He saw that they thought differently than British soldiers. They asked questions. They wanted to understand. Byng told British headquarters to leave Currie alone. "Let him train his men his way," Byng said. "If it fails, I will take the blame. If it succeeds, Canada gets the credit." Currie gathered more resources than anyone thought possible. He needed artillery and lots of it. 983 artillery pieces were brought to the Canadian sector. They ranged from small field guns to massive howitzers that fired shells as heavy as a man. Canadian engineers stockpiled 30,000 tons of ammunition. That was more explosive power than had ever been gathered for a single attack on the Western Front. Shells were stacked in dugouts and covered with tarps. Gunners had to be careful not to smoke near the ammunition dumps. One spark could create an explosion visible for miles. Currie also brought in new technology. Sound-ranging equipment could detect where German artillery fired from by measuring how long it took for the sound to reach different listening posts. This meant Canadian gunners could target enemy artillery before the battle even started. They could knock out German guns before those guns could fire back. British officers had this technology but rarely used it well. Currie made it central to his plan. For 1 week before the attack, Canadian artillery pounded German positions on Vimy Ridge. But this was not random shelling. Every gun had a specific target. Counter-battery teams focused on destroying German artillery. Other guns targeted communication trenches, so German reinforcements could not move forward easily. Heavy howitzers collapsed underground tunnels and bunkers. The barrage was so loud that people in England could hear it across the English Channel, 140 miles away. Canadian soldiers kept practicing. They walked through their practice trenches blindfolded so they could move in smoke and darkness. They practiced with full packs weighing 60 pounds. They learned to work together in small groups, making decisions without waiting for orders from officers who might be dead or wounded. Currie gave sergeants and corporals more power than they had ever had in a British-style army. "If your officer falls," Currie told them, "you keep moving forward. You know the plan. You know your objective. Take it." On April 8th, Currie set the final time for the attack, 5:30 in the morning on April 9th. That was the moment when night turned to day. The Germans would be tired from the long bombardment. The light would be just strong enough to see, but dim enough to provide some cover. 100,000 Canadian soldiers checked their equipment and tried to sleep. Tomorrow they would find out if Currie's radical ideas would work, or if they would just be added to the list of 150,000 men who had already died trying to take Vimy Ridge. At 5:30 in the morning on April 9th, 1917, the world exploded. 983 Canadian artillery guns opened fire at exactly the same moment. The sound was so loud that soldiers could not hear their own voices even when they screamed. The ground shook like an earthquake. Flashes of light turned the dark morning into flickering daylight. Snow mixed with sleet fell sideways in the wind, stinging the faces of Canadian soldiers as they climbed out of their trenches and started walking toward Vimy Ridge. The creeping barrage worked exactly as Currie planned. Shells landed 100 yards ahead of the advancing infantry. Huge columns of dirt and smoke shot into the air. German soldiers huddled deep in their bunkers, praying the bombardment would stop. But it never stopped. It just moved forward, and behind it came the Canadians. They walked through the smoke with rifles ready, staying 75 yards behind the exploding shells. When Germans finally climbed out of their bunkers to man their machine guns, Canadian soldiers were already on top of them. The first German trench line fell in less than an hour. Canadian troops moved through the smoke and chaos, but they were not confused. Every man knew exactly where he was supposed to go. When officers fell wounded, sergeants took over without missing a step. When sergeants died, corporals kept the advance moving. The soldiers had practiced this so many times that they could do it without thinking. They moved like parts of a machine, each piece knowing its job. By noon, the Canadians had captured the top of Vimy Ridge. What took the French and British years of trying, the Canadians did in half a day. German prisoners stumbled down the slopes with their hands raised, shocked at how quickly their perfect fortress had fallen. One German officer was captured, still holding his breakfast. He told his captors he had not believed the attack would break through. "No one ever breaks through on Vimy Ridge," he said. The battle continued for 3 more days as Canadians cleared out the last German positions and secured the entire ridge. When the fighting finally stopped on April 12th, the numbers told an incredible story. The Canadian Corps had suffered 3,598 casualties. This was terrible, and every loss hurt. But compare that to what happened before. The French lost over 150,000 men trying to take the same ground. The British lost tens of thousands more. The Canadians achieved in 4 days what the best armies in Europe could not do in 2.5 years. They captured 4,000 German prisoners and 54 artillery pieces. They took every objective Currie had marked on his sand table models. The victory stunned everyone. British generals who had laughed at Currie's training methods suddenly wanted to know everything about what he did. French commanders asked if Canadian officers could teach their troops the same techniques. Even German generals were shocked. One German commander wrote in his diary that the Canadian assault was the most perfectly organized attack he had ever witnessed. The coordination between artillery and infantry was like nothing he had seen before. Another German officer said that when the Canadians came out of the smoke, his men knew immediately they were facing something different. These soldiers moved with purpose. They did not hesitate. They acted like they knew exactly what would happen next. After Vimy Ridge, everything changed for the Canadian Corps. British High Command started using them as their shock troops. Whenever there was a hard objective to take, whenever there was a strong German position that needed breaking, the Canadians got the call. They became the soldiers you sent when you absolutely had to win. In August 1918, the Canadians led the attack at Amiens. German General Ludendorff later called it the Black Day of the German Army. Canadian troops punched through German lines and advanced 8 miles in a single day. Other Allied armies had spent months trying to move 8 miles. During the final 100 days of the war, from August to November 1918, the Canadian Corps was unstoppable. They advanced more than 100 miles, fighting almost constantly. They broke through the Hindenburg Line, a defensive system the Germans said could never be broken. They liberated dozens of French and Belgian towns. They captured more artillery, more prisoners, and more ground than any other Allied corps their size. The cost was heavy. Thousands of Canadian soldiers died in those final months, but they kept winning. German intelligence officers started noticing a pattern. Whenever Canadians showed up in a sector, a major attack followed within days. German commanders began issuing warnings to their troops. If you identify Canadians in your area, one document said, "Prepare for a significant offensive operation. Expect heavy artillery preparation followed by coordinated infantry assault." The Germans started pulling veteran units out of quiet sectors and rushing them to wherever the Canadians appeared. But it did not help much. The Canadians still broke through. Some German soldiers requested transfers away from any position facing the Canadian Corps. They would rather fight the British or French, they said. One captured German soldier told his interrogators that fighting Canadians was different from fighting other Allied troops. The Canadians never stopped coming, he said. You could shoot at them and they would take cover, but then they would figure out where you were and come at you from another direction. They worked together. They thought. They did not just charge blindly into machine gun fire like so many others did. The sound of battle when Canadians attacked became legendary. The creeping barrage that worked so well at Vimy Ridge became their signature. German soldiers described the terror of hearing that unstoppable wall of explosions moving toward them. knowing that Canadian infantry followed right behind it. The barrage gave them no time to recover, no time to set up defenses, no time to do anything but run or surrender. One German account described shells exploding so close together that the sound became one continuous roar. And through the smoke and dust came the Canadians, rifles ready, moving forward in waves that never seemed to end. The whole situation seemed impossible when you thought about it. Canada was one of the most peaceful countries in the world. Before the war, Canada had almost no army. Most Canadians had never even held a gun, except for hunting. The country had no military academies, no great generals, no warrior tradition going back centuries like the Germans or French or British had. Canada was a place where people went to farm and fish and build quiet lives far from Europe's wars. Yet somehow, these peaceful farmers and lumberjacks and shopkeepers became the most feared assault troops on the Western Front. German intelligence reports from late 1918 showed increasing concern about the Canadian Corps. They were no longer dismissed as inexperienced colonials. Instead, German officers studied Canadian tactics and tried to prepare their men for the coordinated precision of Canadian attacks. But knowing what the Canadians would do and stopping them from doing it were two different things. The training Currie started before Vimy Ridge had spread through the entire Canadian Corps. Every soldier understood his role. Every unit practiced until they could execute complex maneuvers under fire. They were not just following orders, they were solving problems and adapting to battlefield conditions in real time. By the war's end, the Canadian Corps had established a reputation that would last forever. They had gone from being dismissed as colonial amateurs to being recognized as elite. Assault troops, soldiers who started the war never having seen combat, became veterans who broke the strongest defenses Germany could build. And it all started with one simple idea from a former real estate salesman. Treat soldiers like thinking people. Teach them everything. Trust them to make decisions. Give them the tools and knowledge they need, and they will accomplish things that seem impossible. After the war ended in November 1918, armies around the world studied what the Canadians had done. Military academies that once dismissed Currie's ideas now taught them as the right way to prepare soldiers for battle. The British Army changed how it trained troops. The American Army adopted similar methods. Even the French, who had been fighting wars for centuries, recognized that the Canadians had discovered something important. The idea of teaching every soldier the complete battle plan, of trusting ordinary men with complex information, became standard practice in modern militaries. What seemed radical in 1917 became obvious by 1920. The training methods Currie developed spread far beyond just knowing the battle plan. His emphasis on small unit tactics, on giving sergeants and corporals the power to make decisions, on practicing until complex maneuvers became automatic, all of this became part of how professional armies operated. Today, when soldiers train for combat, they learn much more than just how to shoot and march. They learn strategy. They learn why their mission matters. They practice in realistic settings until they can operate without constant orders from above. This all started with a former real estate salesman who believed farmers and shopkeepers could think for themselves. For Canada, Vimy Ridge became something more than just a battle. It became the moment when Canada stopped being just a British colony and started being its own nation. Before Vimy, Canadians thought of themselves as British subjects who happened to live across the ocean. After Vimy, they were Canadians. The victory united English-speaking and French-speaking Canadians in a way nothing else had. When Canadian soldiers took that ridge, they proved to themselves and the world that Canada was not just an extension of Britain. Canada was its own country with its own identity, and that identity was forged in the mud and snow of Vimy Ridge. The Canadian government built a monument on Vimy Ridge that still stands today. It towers over the battlefield, visible for miles. The monument is made of white stone that shines in the sunlight. On its walls are carved the names of 11,285 Canadian soldiers who died in France and have no known grave. Their bodies were never found or identified. They are just gone, disappeared into the mud of the Western Front. The monument reminds visitors that victory always costs something. Those names represent fathers and sons and brothers who never came home. Every year, people visit Vimy Ridge and stand in silence, reading those names, trying to imagine the faces behind them. General Arthur Currie returned to Canada as a hero. Newspapers wrote stories about the brilliant general who led Canada to its greatest military victory. Cities held parades in his honor. But Currie's life was more complicated than the hero stories suggested. Before the war, he had borrowed money from military funds to cover personal debts. He paid the money back, but the scandal followed him. After the war, a newspaper printed accusations about his wartime leadership, claiming he wasted soldiers' lives in pointless attacks. Currie sued for libel and won, but the trial exposed the financial problems from his past. He spent his final years as principal of McGill University in Montreal, respected but not quite celebrated the way other war heroes were. He died in 1933, still defending his decisions and his honor. The broader lessons of Vimy Ridge and the Canadian Corps reached far beyond military tactics. The story revealed something important about where innovation comes from. The British generals who failed to take Vimy Ridge were professionals who had studied war their entire lives. They came from military families. They attended elite academies. They learned from the best teachers Europe could provide. Yet they failed repeatedly because they were trapped by their own assumptions about how war should work. Currie was an outsider who had to figure things out from scratch. He had no traditions holding him back. He could look at a problem and ask simple questions. What if we did it differently? What if the old ways are wrong? This pattern appears throughout history. Outsiders and amateurs often solve problems that experts cannot because they are not locked into existing ways of thinking. The experts know too much about why something cannot work. The outsiders do not know it is impossible, so they try anyway. Currie saw soldiers as thinking people because he had been a civilian himself just a few years earlier. He remembered what it felt like to run a business, to make decisions, to solve problems. British generals who grew up in the military saw soldiers as pieces on a chessboard. That difference in perspective changed everything. The Canadian success at Vimy Ridge also showed what small nations can accomplish when they refuse to accept limitations. Canada had a population of only 8 million people in 1917. Britain had 45 million. France had 40 million. Germany had 65 million. By all logic, Canada should have been a minor player in the war, providing a few troops to help the great powers. Instead, the Canadian Corps became the spearhead of Allied victory. A nation of farmers and fishermen produced an army that broke the deadliest defenses in human history. Size and tradition mattered less than preparation, intelligence, and mutual respect between leaders and soldiers. Looking back over a century later, the story of the Canadian Corps offers lessons that remain relevant today. Organizations, whether military or civilian, work best when information flows freely, and people at every level understand the larger purpose. Companies that trust their employees with full knowledge of business strategy often outperform companies that keep workers in the dark. Teams that practice intensely and prepare thoroughly achieve more than teams with greater natural talent but less dedication. Leaders who listen to people from different backgrounds often find better solutions than leaders who only consult with traditional experts. The contrast between the deadly fighters Canada produced and Canada's peaceful nature reveals a deep truth. The most effective warriors were not men raised from birth to fight. They were not products of martial cultures that glorified violence. They were ordinary people from a quiet country who were given good training, clear information, and leaders who respected their intelligence. When treated as thinking participants rather than expendable units, these peaceful men became capable of extraordinary violence in pursuit of clear objectives. This suggests that human potential for both peace and war depends more on circumstance, leadership, and preparation than on inherent nature. Democracy played a role in the Canadian success. Soldiers from a democratic society were used to making their own decisions in civilian life. They owned property, voted in elections, and ran their own affairs. When military leaders like Currie asked them to think independently on the battlefield, it felt natural. Soldiers from more authoritarian societies were trained from childhood to obey without question. That made them disciplined, but it also made them less adaptable when situations changed quickly. The Canadian approach proved that an army of informed citizens could outfight an army of obedient subjects. The philosophical question at the heart of this story is simple. What makes ordinary people capable of extraordinary things? The answer is not aggression or hatred or natural talent for violence. The answer is preparation, purpose, and mutual respect. When people understand why they are doing something and how to do it well, when they trust their leaders and their leaders trust them, when they practice until excellence becomes habit, they can accomplish what seems impossible. The Canadians who climbed Vimy Ridge in the snow and sleet of April 1917 were not special when they left their farms and towns. They became special because someone believed they could be, gave them the tools they needed, and trusted them to use those tools wisely. That lesson echoes across the decades. Human beings are capable of remarkable things when given knowledge, respect, and clear purpose. We do not need to be born special to achieve special things. We need good preparation, honest information, and leaders who see us as partners rather than pawns. The farmers who became the most feared soldiers on the Western Front proved this truth in the most dramatic way possible. Their legacy is not just monuments and memorials, but a fundamental insight into human nature. Trust people, teach them well, and watch what they accomplish.